Hey guys, tonight we begin with something that's equal parts glamorous and disgusting. So get comfortable, dim the lights, and maybe, light a candle if you're feeling fancy. Though I should warn you, by the end of this story, you may never think about perfume the same way again. Because tonight, we're wandering into the smelly, glittering world of Versailles, where Louis XIV, the so-called Sun King, reigns supreme. Now, if you picture the French court in the 17th century, you're probably thinking about powdered wigs, sparkling jewels, chandeliers dripping with gold, and rooms so ornate they could give you a headache just by looking at them. And yes, Versailles was all of that. But it was also something else. Something much less pleasant. The palace might have been the ultimate symbol of royal wealth and power, but it was also, how do I put this gently? Basically a giant stinking porta potty. And at the center of it all was Louis himself, the man who controlled Europe's fashion, politics, and military. But apparently not his own soap supply. Now, Louis XIV wasn't exactly unique in his hygiene habits. Early modern Europeans weren't big on bathing. Doctors in the 17th century liked to warn people that water opened up the pores and made you vulnerable to disease. Which, of course, sounds ridiculous now. But back then, if you told someone, hey, you should take a shower every day, they would have looked at you like you just suggested drinking poison. So people didn't bathe much. Instead, they believed in what we might generously call alternative methods, like changing your shirt, because yes, to them, slipping into a fresh linen shirt counted as cleaning yourself. The fabric was supposed to absorb the dirt and sweat, which is, one way of doing it. Louis, however, was in a league of his own. He was famously known to have taken a grand total of, wait for it, about 3 baths in his entire life. 3. And one of those was apparently by accident, which makes him, in a way, the original minimalist influencer. Except instead of bragging about his capsule wardrobe, he was casually setting records for human odor. Now, before we judge too harshly, let's remember, bathing back then was genuinely scary to people. The Black Death was still a fresh memory, and medical advice leaned toward avoid water at all costs. But still, Louis took things to the extreme. For the most part, his idea of cleaning up was dumping buckets of perfume over himself. And this is where France's legendary perfume industry really comes into play. Those little glass bottles of scented oils and floral concoctions weren't just there to make people smell nice. They were survival equipment, because Versailles was basically unlivable without them. Let's drift then into the palace itself. The glorious, shining Versailles. From the outside, it was a marvel. Miles of manicured gardens, fountains, gilded gates, endless rooms of marble and mirrors. But inside, it was chaos. Thousands of courtiers swarmed the place every day, all trying to catch the king's eye. Which means they were also eating, drinking, scheming, flirting, and doing their business, literally. Because, fun fact, Versailles didn't exactly have enough toilets. Actually, it barely had any. And when you have thousands of powdered, wigged nobles running around with nowhere proper to go, well, you can imagine the result. People use stairwells, hallways, corners of rooms, sometimes even fireplaces, which makes you wonder how anyone ever concentrated during a ball. The stench, by all accounts, was overwhelming. Visitors from other countries often wrote home about how disgusting it was. They admired the glittering chandeliers, but complained that the smell could knock you flat. And the courtiers themselves, they just pretended not to notice. Because what were you going to do? Tell the most powerful man in Europe that his palace smelled like a public latrine? Probably not. Now, Louis himself didn't exactly make things better. His personal habits added to the overall atmosphere. For one, he had terrible dental problems. which of course wasn't unusual for the time. Dentistry in the 17th century was basically a horror show, but Louis's teeth were especially bad. By middle age, his mouth was a disaster zone. He lost so many teeth that his cheeks sagged inward, making him look older than he was. Eating became a challenge, and his breath, well, let's just say it wasn't described as minty fresh dot, and then there were his other ailments. Louis suffered from a series of boils and abscesses throughout his life. At one point, he even had an operation to remove an anal fistula, which is exactly as unpleasant as it sounds. The surgery was such a big deal that inspired a whole trend at court. Nobles had little bows sewn onto their clothing to honor the king's medical ordeal. Yes, you heard that right. Imagine your boss gets hemorrhoid surgery, and suddenly everyone at the office starts wearing little badges in solidarity. That was Versailles, but back to hygiene. Since bathing was out of the question, Louis leaned heavily on clothes and scents. He changed outfits constantly, sometimes several times a day. His linen shirts were supposed to soak up the dirt and sweat, and when they were replaced, that counted as clean. And, of course, there was perfume. Mountains of it. Louis adored strong, musky scents, which he wore in abundance. The courtiers did the same. So Versailles became a place where layers of human odor mingled with gallons of overpowering perfume. Imagine the world's fanciest bathroom, but sprayed with enough cologne to choke a horse. That was life at the French court. Now. Here's the funny thing. While Louis avoided baths, he was obsessed with appearances. He spent hours getting dressed, choosing outfits, and performing little rituals that showed off his status. Everything about him was carefully choreographed. His morning routine, called the lever, was practically a theatrical performance. Nobles would gather to watch him wake up, get dressed, and eat breakfast. Yes, people literally fought for the honor of handing the king his slippers. Which, if you think about it, is hilarious. Imagine elbowing your rival aside, just for the privilege of touching Louis XIV's very unwashed feet. This obsession with ritual cleanliness of clothes but not the body kind of sums up Louis' approach to hygiene. He wanted to look immaculate. Sparkling wig, flawless lace, gleaming shoes. But underneath it all, let's just say things were less pristine. It was a kind of don't ask, don't tell policy with hygiene. As long as no one said anything, everyone pretended it was fine, but the smells didn't just come from people. Versailles itself was an architectural nightmare for hygiene. The palace had no proper plumbing, and chamber pots were often emptied out of windows into the gardens below. Which makes me wonder how many unsuspecting guests got splashed while taking a stroll. Add in the sheer number of animals, horses, hunting dogs, livestock, and you've got yourself a full sensory experience. Glamorous, yes, but also revolting. And yet, for all of this, Versailles was still the envy of Europe. Other monarchs tried to copy it, stench and all, because that's how much influence Louis had. His version of clean became the gold standard. If he decided that linen shirts counted as a bath, then that was the trend. If he doused himself in perfume, so did everyone else. Which just goes to show, power doesn't need to make sense. It just needs to sparkle enough to distract people from the smell. So, tonight, as we drift through the marble halls of Versailles, remember that behind the gilded mirrors and glittering chandeliers, there were also chamber pots, overflowing stairwells, and a king who thought 3 baths were more than enough for one lifetime. A reminder that history, no matter how glamorous, is always a little grosser than we want to believe. And with that, let's ease into the next part of Louis' story, where we'll look at how his court handled these less than pleasant realities, and how hygiene, or the lack of it, shaped life under the Sun King. Alright, so we've established that Louis XIV wasn't a big fan of bathing, or really of basic soap and water in general. But what he lacked in hygiene, he made up for with ritual. Because Versailles wasn't just a palace, it was basically one giant stage, and Louis was the star of the show. Every move he made, every little gesture, was turned into a performance. And yes, that includes things that we would normally consider private. Take his mornings, for example. The lever, or rising, was one of the most bizarre daily spectacles you can imagine. Imagine this. The king wakes up in his giant gold-draped bed. Immediately, courtiers begin streaming into his room. Not just his closest advisors, but nobles, aristocrats, and people who had managed to elbow their way onto the guest list. By the end of the ritual, over 100 people might be crammed in there, watching him go through what was basically his bathroom routine, except without the bathroom part. First came the doctors and surgeons who checked in on the king's health. They might poke at his sores or ask him about his latest digestive issues, which were constant. Then came the grooming. His face would be wiped down with a cloth dipped in spirits or scented water, which counted as washing. He didn't splash his face with water like we would. Instead, it was more like patting down a sweaty dog with Febreze. Then, one by one, layers of clothing were put on him, each handed over by a different ranked noble. Passing the king his stockings was a sign of immense favor. Helping him slip on his shirt was practically a political appointment. Now, you'd think watching a grown man get dressed would be boring. And you'd be right. But at Versailles, it was a privilege. Because it meant you were near the king. And proximity to Louis meant power. People schemed, bribed, and clawed their way into these rituals just so they could be part of the royal dressing process. Which tells you everything you need to know about how Versailles functioned. It was a world where handing over a wig could make or break your career, and, of course, while all this was happening, the king might also relieve himself. Yes, the lever sometimes included Louis sitting on his commode chair, which was basically a fancy toilet disguised as furniture. He would chat with his courtiers while using it, because apparently there was nothing more normal at Versailles than discussing state policy while the king went about his digestive business. Nobles even considered it an honor to be present during this moment. Again, imagine being thrilled because your boss let you watch him go to the bathroom. That was life at Versailles. But the king wasn't the only one with odd routines. The entire palace was built around these rituals of controlled chaos. And because Versailles lacked basic plumbing, chamber pots were everywhere. Nobles carried them around or kept them tucked in alcoves. Servants emptied them out windows or into the gardens, which meant that walking through Versailles was an exercise in vigilance. You never quite knew what might be coming down from above. And yet, despite all this, Versailles was also the most fashionable place in Europe. Its halls were lined with gleaming mirrors, gilded carvings, and ornate marble floors. But here's the thing, those mirrors didn't just reflect beauty. They reflected odor. The palace was designed to impress the eyes, not the nose. Which is why perfume was the glue that held it all together. If Versailles was a perfume ad, it would read something like, masking the smell of feces since 1682. Louis himself loved perfume. He had personal perfumers who concocted custom blends just for him. Strong musks, heavy florals, exotic spices, he layered them on like armor. But perfume in Versailles wasn't just about personal taste. It was survival. Without it, you'd be knocked flat by the sheer density of smells in those crowded rooms. The combination of sweat, unwashed bodies, rotting food, and chamber pots required industrial-strength masking. Which is why France's perfume industry boomed under Louis. It wasn't just fashion. It was necessity. Now, let's drift into the dining halls for a moment. Eating at Versailles was just as much of a performance as getting dressed. Louis dined in public, with dozens of courtiers watching him chew, which, considering his dental situation, must have been an adventure to witness. By middle age, The man had lost so many teeth that he struggled to eat solid food. Soups and broths became his staples. Meat had to be chopped into tiny pieces, and yet people watched him eat as if it were a sacred ritual. Imagine standing silently while someone slurps soup for 20 minutes, and you'll get the idea. Of course, the meals themselves were enormous. Dozens of courses, overflowing tables, exotic dishes. But the leftovers? They piled up. Food rotted quickly in the heat, and without refrigeration, the stench became part of the atmosphere. Servants scurried around trying to keep things presentable, but there's only so much you can do when you've got piles of meat sitting out for hours. Add in the constant swarms of flies, and you have a very different picture than the pristine, candlelit feasts we like to imagine. And then there's the issue of personal space. Versailles was never designed to be a comfortable home. It was designed to be crowded. Louis wanted his nobles living under his watchful eye, which meant stuffing as many people into the palace as possible. Bedrooms were shared, privacy was almost non-existent, and the walls were thin enough for gossip to spread instantly, which also meant the smells spread instantly. You could always tell what your neighbor was up to or eating or not bathing in. What's interesting is how everyone just adapted. The lack of hygiene became normal. Nobles might grumble about the smell in private, but they accepted it as part of court life. Because really, what choice did they have? If you wanted to be near the king, you put up with the stench. You smiled, you powdered your wig, and you doused yourself in perfume. That was the price of proximity to power, and Louis himself seemed completely unbothered. He was, after all, the Sun King. He believed that his presence made everything around him shine. And if that shine came with a little odor, well, that was just part of the package. He controlled fashion, he controlled politics, and he controlled the very rhythms of daily life at Versailles. Hygiene, or the lack of it, was simply another way of showing that he set the rules, and everyone else had to follow. It's worth noting, though, that not everyone in Europe lived like this. Other courts, particularly in Northern Europe, had slightly different attitudes toward cleanliness. The English, for example, were more into washing with water, though still not daily baths. The Dutch were relatively clean by comparison, with a culture of scrubbing and tidying that would have horrified a French courtier. But France under Louis XIV was the trendsetter. If the Sun King said linen shirts counted as baths, then everyone nodded and agreed so in a strange way. Versailles was both the height of civilization and the peak of filth. A glittering palace of gold, filled with courtiers who smelled like a mixture of sweat, perfume, and questionable medical treatments. It was theater. The dirt didn't matter as long as the performance dazzled, and that's the paradox of Louis XIV's hygiene. He was both the dirtiest and the cleanest man in Europe. His body might have been unwashed, but his image was spotless. His clothes were immaculate, his wigs perfectly powdered, his rituals finely tuned. He embodied the idea that appearance was everything, even if the reality underneath was less than fragrant. So, as we continue to drift through this palace of contradictions, let's follow Louis beyond the dining halls and the dressing chambers and into his medical world. Because if you thought the lack of baths was bad, wait until we talk about 17th century medicine. Trust me, the cures were sometimes worse than the illnesses. So, by now, we've strolled through Versailles. We've tiptoed past the overflowing chamber pots, and we've watched Louis XIV get dressed in front of 100 people without taking so much as a bath. You'd think that would be enough discomfort for one man. But no, because Louis's life was also one long medical saga. And if you think modern doctor visits are stressful, just imagine living in a world where your treatment might involve leeches, enemas, or the occasional bit of powdered numbing. Let's ease into this gently. Louis was not a particularly healthy man. In fact, by the time he hit middle age, his body was basically falling apart in slow motion, which, to be fair, wasn't that unusual for the 17th century. But because he was king, every cough, every sore, every toothache turned into a public affair. His doctors kept meticulous notes, and the whole court was obsessed with his health. After all, the Sun King wasn't supposed to flicker out too soon. One of Louis's most famous medical issues was his mouth. His dental problems were legendary. By his 40s, he had lost most of his teeth, thanks to the combination of bad genetics, poor hygiene, and the complete lack of anything resembling dentistry. Cavities weren't filled, they were drilled, pulled, or just ignored until they caused infections. At one point, Louis had an operation that went so badly it actually punched a hole between his mouth and his nasal cavity, which meant that when he drank, liquid sometimes leaked out of his nose. Very regal, I know, but of course, Louis kept right on with his public dining rituals. Imagine sitting silently while the most powerful man in Europe tried to sip soup without it dripping through his face. Nobody dared laugh, of course. This was the Sun King. If he wanted to turn lunch into a plumbing experiment, then everyone politely pretended it was normal dot, and then there was the infamous anal fistula. Yes, you heard that correctly. Around 1686, Louis developed a painful fistula, basically an infected tunnel near his rectum. Not exactly the sort of thing you want when you're trying to maintain an image of divine majesty. For weeks, he suffered in silence, trying to carry on with his public routines. But eventually, the pain became unbearable, and surgery was the only option. Now, surgery in the 17th century was not something you wanted. There were no anesthetics, no antibiotics, no sterile instruments. It was basically just sharp knives, strong hands, and a lot of hope. But Louis had no choice. His surgeons prepared for the procedure, and of course, because this was Versailles, it turned into yet another public spectacle. The king's operation was attended by a small audience of courtiers, eager to witness medical history. The surgery was a success against all odds. The doctors managed to cut away the infected tissue, and Louis survived, which in itself was a miracle. The court was so relieved that they turned the whole ordeal into a trend. Nobles began wearing little bows on their clothing, called a la fistule, in honor of the king's recovery. Yes, really. And anal surgery started a fashion craze. Because apparently, nothing said loyal subject like proudly displaying your monarch's medical condition on your sleeve, but this wasn't a one-off. Louis's medical treatments were constant. His doctors believed in balance, the old idea that the body was governed by 4 humors: blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile. If you were sick, it meant one of these humors was out of balance. And the solution? Get rid of the excess, which is why Louis spent much of his life being bled, purged, and dosed with laxatives. By some counts, he endured thousands of enemas over the course of his reign. Thousands. His doctors were basically obsessed with flushing him out, and here's the kicker. Louis actually believed it worked. He trusted his doctors completely. Every time they recommended another enema, he went along with it, which meant that the most powerful man in Europe spent much of his adult life lying on his side, being subjected to treatments that probably did more harm than good, but of course it wasn't just enemas. His doctors also prescribed exotic concoctions. Mercury was a common ingredient, believed to cure everything from syphilis to skin conditions. Herbs, powders, and animal parts were all fair game. At one point, ground-up human remains were actually considered medicinal. Mummy powder, made from bits of embalmed corpses, was thought to have healing properties. So it's entirely possible that Louis ingested a little powdered pharaoh along the way. Nothing like a bit of ancient Egyptian to go with your morning wine. And yet, despite this constant assault, Louis lived a remarkably long life for his era. He reigned for 72 years, the longest of any French monarch, which is kind of ironic considering how much his body suffered along the way. Maybe the endless enemas did something after all, or maybe he just had the world's strongest constitution. Of course, the court turned all of this into ritual. Every time Louis had a medical procedure, it became an event. Courtiers whispered, speculated, and waited anxiously for updates. His body wasn't just his own, it was a public symbol. If the king was healthy, the state was stable. If the king was weak, the whole system trembled. Which is why his doctor's notes read like a running commentary on the fate of France. And through it all, Louis kept up appearances. He might have been suffering, bleeding, or leaking soup out his nose, but he never let it break the illusion of grandeur. His clothes were perfect, his wigs towering, his movements regal. Versailles might have smelled like a latrine, and his body might have been falling apart, but as long as the performance continued, the Sun King still shone. It's worth pausing here to think about how different ideas of health and hygiene were back then. Today, we focus on exercise, balanced diets, maybe the occasional multivitamin. Back then, health was about purging, bleeding, and avoiding water. And Louis, with all his wealth and power, was still trapped in the same bad science as everyone else. In fact, he suffered more because his doctors were constantly hovering, eager to try out the latest theories on their royal patient. Being king meant you were never left alone, not even in your most personal medical crises. So, as we drift further into this story, remember that Versailles was not just a palace of gold and perfume. It was also a place where the king's bowels were practically a matter of state policy. His body was political, his ailments were public, and his survival was, in many ways, miraculous. Now, let's float over to another aspect of his life, the rituals of food, fashion, and sleep. Because if you thought his medical treatments were strange, wait until you hear how he managed his daily schedule. Spoiler, it involved even less privacy, even more ceremony, and, of course, a generous dose of bad hygiene. So, we've talked about Louis XIV's questionable bathing habits. We've peeked at Versailles' overflowing chamber pots. And we've endured his medical adventures involving teeth, soup, and, yes, an anal fistula. But here's the thing about Louis. None of that really slowed him down. Because above all else, Louis XIV was about routine. He didn't just live his life, he staged it. Every single day was a carefully choreographed performance, and his courtiers were the audience. Or maybe the extras. Or sometimes even the props. Let's settle into his schedule. Louis was an early riser, which honestly feels unfair. You'd think if you were the most powerful man in Europe, you could sleep in a little. But no. The king's day began around 8 a.m. when he was ceremoniously woken in his enormous bed. This wasn't just a casual stretch and yawn moment. No, the lever or rising was one of the most important rituals at Versailles. The first wave of attendants would enter, starting with his personal physicians and surgeons, because nothing says good morning quite like a team of doctors hovering over you, checking your pulse and making notes on your bowel movements. After them came high-ranking nobles, eager to be part of the ritual. They would crowd around, waiting for their turn to perform small tasks, handing him a shirt, offering him a wig, or simply standing there, basking in the glow of the king's presence. Now, here's where it gets entertaining. The order in which people were admitted to the room was strictly controlled. If you had access to the early part of the lever, you were very important. If you were stuck in the second wave, or worse, the third, you were basically Versailles' version of a bench warmer. And people cared deeply about this. Being allowed to hand Louis his stockings could make or break a political career. Imagine lobbying for months just so you could touch another man's socks. That was life under the Sun King. Once dressed, Louis moved on to prayers and breakfast. And again, this was public. The king did not eat alone. Dozens of courtiers gathered to watch him enjoy a light morning meal, usually bread, eggs, and sometimes a bit of broth. And of course, a cup of wine, because it was the 17th century and nobody thought twice about drinking alcohol first thing in the morning. Honestly, considering the state of the water supply, wine was probably the safer option anyway. After breakfast came a flood of meetings, audiences, and ceremonies. Louis rarely made decisions in private. Instead, he held court in his chambers, his salons, or while walking through the gardens. Everywhere he went, people trailed behind him, eager for a moment of eye contact or a nod of approval. Privacy was practically non-existent. The king was on display from morning until night like a living exhibit. Versailles was less a palace and more a zoo where Louis was the main attraction. And let's talk about meals. Because if there's one thing Louis enjoyed, it was eating. His midday meal, the grand couvert, was another public ritual. The king dined in full view of his courtiers, seated at a table piled high with dishes. We're talking dozens of courses, everything from roast meats to delicate pastries. Servants bustled back and forth, presenting food with great ceremony. Nobles watched silently as if attending a play. And yes, sometimes they whispered, sometimes they gossiped, but mostly they just stood there watching the king chew. Imagine dedicating your life to politics, and your big moment is standing in a crowded room while Louis XIV tries to swallow a piece of undercooked venison. Of course. The irony here is that by middle age, Louis had so few teeth that eating was a struggle. He relied heavily on soups, stews, and foods that could be cut into very small pieces. Meals that should have been feasts often turned into long, awkward exercises in chewing very slowly. But nobody dared to comment. They just pretended everything was perfectly majestic, even as the king dribbled broth into his napkin. And then there was fashion. Louis adored clothes. His wardrobe was legendary hundreds upon hundreds of outfits, dripping with lace, embroidery, and jewels. He spent hours choosing what to wear each day, and each choice carried political weight. Colors, fabrics, and accessories all sent signals. Wearing gold embroidery wasn't just about looking flashy. It was about reminding everyone that he was the Sun King, the center of the universe. Shoes, in particular, were a favorite. Louis loved heels, bright red ones, to be exact. They gave him extra height, which he needed, because despite his commanding image, Louis was only about 5'4". The heels became such a status symbol that he decreed only nobles of a certain rank could wear red shoes. So, next time you see a pair of La Bowdens, just remember, they're basically a recycled Louis XIV flex, but the wigs might have been the most important accessory of all. Louis started losing his hair in his 20s, and instead of panicking, he turned it into a trend. He began wearing massive wigs cascading, curly creations that made him look taller and more imposing. Soon, the entire court followed suit. Nobles spent fortunes on wigs, some made from real human hair, others from goat or horse. The bigger and fluffier, the better. Which, of course, added another layer of smell to Versailles because wigs were not exactly easy to keep clean. Perfume had to do the heavy lifting. Now, let's glide toward the evenings. After a long day of ceremonies, audiences, and rituals, you might think Louis would finally get some peace. But no, his evenings were just as public as his mornings. He attended plays, ballets, or concerts in the palace. He hosted gambling sessions and lavish parties. He even staged elaborate dances, sometimes starring in them himself. Yes, the Sun King literally performed in ballets, dressed as Apollo, the god of the sun. Subtlety was not really his style. And then, when the night wound down, came the couture, or going to bed ceremony. Just like his rising, this was a public event. Courtiers gathered to watch the king undress and climb into bed. The order in which they were allowed to help with this ritual was another marker of favor. Handing Louis his nightshirt was considered an honor. Imagine telling your grandchildren, "Ah yes, my proudest moment in life was helping a sweaty monarch get into his pajamas. That was the dream at Versailles. The bed itself was enormous, draped in gold and silk, but Louis rarely slept alone. Not always in the scandalous sense, though he certainly had mistresses, but in the sense that attendants were often nearby, ready to serve at a moment's notice. Even at night, the king was never truly private. His body, his sleep, even his snoring belonged to the state. Now, you might be wondering, wasn't any of this exhausting? Didn't Louis ever just want to take a quiet walk, eat a meal alone, or, I don't know, take an actual bath? Maybe, but for Louis, routine was power. The constant ceremonies reminded everyone of their place in the hierarchy. Nobles wasted their time chasing the honor of handing him slippers instead of plotting rebellion. Rituals kept the court occupied and distracted, and Louis firmly in control. So, in a way, the endless routine of Versailles was genius. It may have been smelly, tedious, and frankly ridiculous, but it worked. The nobles were too busy squabbling over wig powder and sock duty to organize against the crown. And Louis, meanwhile, cemented his image as the absolute monarch, the man around whom the entire French universe revolved. Of course, behind the scenes, it was all a bit grimier. Servants scrambled to clean up messes, chamber pots piled up, and the palace reeked of sweat, perfume, and food scraps. But nobody talked about that. On the surface, everything glittered. And that was enough. So as we drift deeper into this story, keep in mind the paradox of Louis XIV's life. He lived in a palace that looked like heaven, but smelled like hell. He was surrounded by thousands of people, but had no real privacy. He was dressed in gold and lace, but avoided soap and water. His life was one long performance, a theater of power and perfume, staged on top of a foundation of filth. And with that thought, let's move forward into the twilight years of Louis' reign. Because as the Sun King grew older, his routines didn't just continue, they became heavier, stranger, and even more out of touch with reality. Versailles kept sparkling, but the cracks beneath the surface grew wider. So far, we've followed Louis XIV from his bedazzled mornings to his perfume-drenched evenings. We've seen the endless rituals, the piles of wigs, the meals eaten in front of silent crowds. We've seen him avoid baths with Olympic-level commitment. But no matter how much gold you pile on, time has a way of catching up with everyone. Even the Sun King. By the time Louis reached his 70s, his body was not what it once was. Which is saying something because, let's be honest, it wasn't great to begin with. He had survived boils, fistulas, rotten teeth, and about 4,000 enemas. He had outlived his queen, most of his mistresses, and sadly, even many of his own children and grandchildren. For a man who styled himself as eternal, Louis spent his later years surrounded by funerals. Versailles glittered, but it was haunted by the smell of mortality. Physically, Louis was deteriorating. His legs swelled with gout. Walking became painful. His jaw sagged where teeth used to be, giving him that distinctive sunken look in portraits. He still piled on wigs, lace, and heels, but beneath the surface, the Sun King was fading. He even developed gangrene in his leg toward the end, a condition that slowly ate away at him. Doctors tried every bizarre remedy they could think of, but nothing worked. Surgery was attempted, but his body simply couldn't take it anymore, and through it all, the routines continued. The lever still took place. The couture still happened. Courtiers still gathered to watch him eat soup with trembling hands. Versailles was a theater that never closed, and Louis refused to dim the lights. To stop the rituals would have been to admit weakness, and the Sun King was not about to let that happen. Even as his body decayed, the performance went on. But let's drift for a moment into the other side of Louis's life, his love affairs. Because Versailles wasn't just about politics and perfumes. It was also about mistresses. And Louis had quite a few. His most famous early mistress was Louise de la Valliere, who bore him several children. She was followed by Madame de Montespan, known for her sharp wit and sharper temper. Montespan was a force of nature at court, dazzling and domineering until scandal caught up with her. She was implicated in the infamous affair of the poisons, a web of witchcraft, fortune-tellers, and accusations of black masses held in Paris. Nothing was ever proven directly against her, but the stain of rumor was enough to push her out of favor. After Montespan came Madame de Maintenon, the woman who would remain with Louis for the rest of his life. Unlike his earlier mistresses, Maintenon was pious, serious, and not particularly interested in glittering parties. She encouraged Louis to turn more devout in his later years, pulling him away from the debauchery of his younger court. There are strong hints that Louis and Maintenon secretly married, though it was never officially acknowledged. If they did, she wasn't queen, just the king's quiet, moral anchor in his twilight years. And yet, even as his personal life slowed down, the palace didn't. Versailles was still packed with nobles, mistresses in waiting, sycophants, and schemers. Hygiene remained as questionable as ever. Courtiers still relieved themselves in hallways. Perfume still battled chamber pots for dominance. Louis himself might have been limping toward death, but the system he built churned on like a glittering, smelly machine. One particularly grim aspect of his decline was how visible it all was. Unlike ordinary people who could at least suffer in private, Louis had an audience. His medical problems were never secret. His operations were public. His decay was witnessed by hundreds of courtiers who dutifully recorded every detail. Even his gangrenous leg became a matter of state, discussed in whispers across Europe. His body, right up to the end, was political theater. And when he finally died in 1715, after 72 years on the throne, Versailles was plunged into mourning. But even his funeral couldn't escape the realities of hygiene. Louis's body, embalmed in the fashion of the time, still began to decay. The stench of death followed the cortege, just as the stench of life had filled Versailles. In a way, it was fitting. The man who avoided baths for his entire reign left behind a legacy that was as fragrant as it was foul. But here's the paradox. For all the filth, all the bad smells, all the medical disasters, Louis XIV remains one of the most iconic monarchs in history. His palace is still a symbol of French grandeur. His reign defined an era. People remember the Sun King's golden image, not his toothless smile or his enemas. Which just goes to show, appearances really do matter. If you shine brightly enough, people will politely ignore the smell. Of course, the cracks in his system became clear after his death. His wars had drained the treasury. His obsession with Versailles had left the countryside impoverished. And his heirs inherited not just a glittering palace, but also a culture of waste, ritual, and, yes, questionable hygiene. Within a century, that world would collapse in the French Revolution. The Sun King's legacy was dazzling, but it came with a price. Still, for our purposes tonight, Louis XIV remains a fascinating reminder that history is never as clean as we imagine. Behind the portraits and palaces are real people with real bodies, aching, aging, and quite often unwashed. His Versailles was a wonder of the world, but it was also a swamp of perfume, chamber pots, and endless ceremony. And Louis himself was the embodiment of that paradox, glowing like the sun on the outside, but decaying slowly beneath the lace dot. So as we drift toward the end of this long story, let's take one last gentle walk through Versailles. Past the gardens where nobles gossiped while dodging suspicious puddles. Past the mirrored halls, glittering with chandeliers and reeking faintly of too much musk. Past the grand bed, where a king performed his rising and sleeping for an audience of hundreds. And finally, to the quiet chapels, where his subjects prayed for the health of a monarch who was, more often than not, in desperate need of a bath. The Sun King may be gone, but his perfume lingers both literally and historically. And if there's one lesson we can take from him, it's that power doesn't always need soap. Sometimes it just needs lace, wigs, and a very strong sense of theater. So Louis XIV finally died in 1715. His body gave out, his gangrenous leg turned black, and after 72 years of running the grandest, smelliest theater in Europe, the curtain came down. But death, as we know, doesn't really stop a monarch's influence. In many ways, Louis XIV's habits and his palace outlived him, shaping not just his immediate successors, but the whole idea of kingship in Europe. And yes, that included the hygiene. Because Versailles, even without the Sun King, still reeked. His great-grandson, Louis XV, inherited the throne as a child. Now, Louis XV has his own reputation problems. He's remembered as lazy, pleasure-seeking, and endlessly distracted by mistresses, but when it came to hygiene, things didn't exactly improve. Versailles remained a place where indoor plumbing was basically non-existent. Courtiers continued to relieve themselves in hallways, gardens, and stairwells. The smell was still masked by perfume and incense, and the great rituals that Louis XIV had perfected kept going, even though they were increasingly ridiculous without his charisma to anchor them down. In fact, under Louis XV, Versailles became even more notorious for its moral decay. If Louis XIV's Versailles smelled of sweat, wigs, and rotting teeth, Louis XV's Versailles smelled of something else entirely: perfume, powder, and illicit romance. Hygiene was not the priority. It was about appearances, seduction, and keeping up with the ever-fickle fashion of the 18th century. So the same problems lingered: dirty corridors, unwashed bodies, and enough scented powder in the air to choke a horse stat. And then, of course, there was Louis XVI. Poor Louis XVI. By the time he took the throne in 1774, the world had changed. Enlightenment thinkers were talking about science, medicine, arisen, and yes, even hygiene. Paris had begun to modernize, and the people were a little less tolerant of their rulers living in splendor while the streets outside stink of filth and poverty. But Versailles itself? Still a palace of ritual and smells. The Sun King system had calcified. Everything was performance. Nothing was private. And hygiene was still firmly at the bottom of the priority list. Louis XVI, bless him, was a somewhat awkward man who preferred tinkering with locks to ruling a kingdom. He wasn't exactly glamorous, and he wasn't exactly a reformer. His queen, Marie Antoinette, tried to shake things up by creating her own little retreat, the Petit Trianon, where she could escape the rigid life of Versailles and play at being a shepherdess. But even then, the palace's reputation for filth and waste persisted. Ordinary people, reading pamphlets about the court, became increasingly disgusted by the contrast between their hunger and the nobles' perfumed excess. And here's where the story comes full circle. Louis XIV built Versailles as a stage for his greatness. He made his own body, his rising and sleeping, his meals and medicines into public rituals. But by the time of Louis XVI, that system had turned from awe-inspiring to absurd. Instead of inspiring loyalty, it bred resentment. Instead of awe, it caused laughter. And when the French Revolution finally came, Versailles became the ultimate symbol of everything wrong with monarchy, waste, arrogance, and, of course, filth. The revolutionaries stormed the palace in 1789, finding not just gold and jewels, but also the decaying infrastructure of a system that had never bothered with proper plumbing. Versailles was abandoned as a royal residence. The Sun King's Grand Theater closed its doors, leaving behind mirrors, chandeliers, and a lingering stink of centuries-old bad habits. But the legacy of Louis XIV's hygiene, or lack thereof, went beyond France. Across Europe, monarchs imitated his style. Palaces in Austria, Spain, and Germany borrowed the grandeur of Versailles, and with it came the rituals of display and the same disregard for cleanliness. Bathing remained suspect well into the 18th century. Perfume industries flourished because nothing sells like covering up smells. And nobles everywhere learned that appearances mattered more than soap dot. It's only in the 19th century, really, that attitudes shifted. With advances in medicine and plumbing, the idea of daily bathing became normal, at least for the middle and upper classes. By then, Louis XIV's Versailles seemed like another world, a glittering relic of a time when people powdered their wigs instead of washing their hair, and when courtiers thought nothing of using a palace corner as a restroom. The contrast is almost comical. Victorians, obsessed with cleanliness and moral order, looked back at the Sun King's court with a mix of fascination and horror. And yet, even now, Versailles remains breathtaking. Visitors walk through the Hall of Mirrors and rarely think about the smell that once hung in the air. They admire the gold, the gardens, the symmetry. They don't picture the chamber pots being emptied out the windows. They don't imagine Louis XIV sipping broth while soup leaked from his nasal cavity. The myth endures because history has a way of editing out the odors, but maybe it's worth remembering them. Because the story of Louis XIV's hygiene is more than just a gross anecdote. It tells us something important about power. It shows how image can outweigh reality, how ritual can disguise decay, and how even the filthiest habits can be spun into symbols of greatness. The Sun King didn't bathe, but he convinced the world he was divine. Versailles stank, but it dazzled enough to distract. That's power, not soap, not perfume, but the ability to make people believe. So, as we finally settle in at the end of this long story, picture the palace at dusk. The sun setting over the gardens, the fountains trickling faintly, the chandeliers flickering to life inside the halls, and somewhere in the quiet of his private chamber, the old king sits, wrapped in lace and velvet, pretending not to notice the smell. He smiles faintly, toothless, his body failing, but the performance still intact. For him and for the world watching, the show never really ended, and maybe that's why Louis XIV still fascinates us today. Not because of the perfumes, or the wigs, or even the wars he fought, but because he reminds us that history is both glittering and grotesque. That behind every golden throne is a chamber pot, that every sun casts shadows, and that sometimes the most human thing about a king is not his greatness, but the stink he leaves behind. So, with that image in mind, I'll let you drift off to sleep. The Sun King is gone. The perfumes have faded. The palace is quiet. And the story, for tonight at least, has come to an end. Sweet dreams. And may your own kingdom have slightly better plumbing. So, we've spent 6 long, perfume-saturated parts floating through Versailles with Louis XIV. We've smelled the chamber pots, endured the enemas, and politely nodded while soup leaked out of the king's nose. But before we finally close the curtains, it might be nice to pull back a little, because Louis XIV was not some isolated case of royal grossness. He was part of a much larger tradition, European pattern where power and filth often went hand in hand. Let's start with the basics. For much of early modern Europe, bathing was considered dangerous. The belief was that hot water opened the pores, and once your pores were open, disease could sneak in. Which sounds almost scientific until you remember that the actual germs were lurking on people's unwashed skin and clothing. So, instead of bathing, nobles preferred to wipe themselves down with linen cloths. The idea was that linen absorbed impurities. It didn't, It just gave them a slightly smoother layer of grime. The sphere of water went all the way up the social ladder. Royals across Europe avoided baths. Queen Elizabeth I of England supposedly bathed once a month, whether she needed it or not, which, spoiler, she definitely did. Spanish Habsburgs, with their famously unfortunate genetics, weren't big on soap either. And Russian Tsars, though they had access to steam baths, often preferred sweat and vodka to anything resembling hygiene. So Louis XIV wasn't unique. He was just particularly good at turning his filth into a performance. And here's the fun part: perfume. The perfume industry in France absolutely boomed under Louis XIV. Grasse, the perfume capital, churned out scents designed to cover every imaginable odor. Courtiers practically marinated in musk, ambergris, rosewater, and civet. Civet, by the way, came from the glands of a small cat-like animal. So, yes, people were dousing themselves in glandular secretions to smell less like chamber pots. The irony writes itself, but let's glide over to another aspect of royal hygiene, or the lack thereof: dentistry. Louis XIV wasn't the only monarch with terrible teeth. His relatives, the Bourbons and Habsburgs, were walking dental disasters. Centuries of inbreeding left jaws misaligned, teeth crowded, and gums diseased. Charles II of Spain, the tragic bewitched, could barely chew. His jaw was so deformed he drooled constantly, and his health was a parade of misery. Louis at least had charisma to distract people. Poor Charles had nothing but a weak chin and a palace full of priests praying for a miracle. Spoiler, no miracle came. Medical treatments didn't help. Across Europe, royal doctors prescribed the same bleeding, purging, and mercury-laced concoctions that nearly finished off Louis. It wasn't just him, everyone, from England's Stuarts to Austria's Habsburgs, endured similar cures. The difference was that Louis somehow survived them long enough to project an image of eternal sunshine. Most of his relatives weren't so lucky dot, and then, of course, there were the toilets. Or rather, the lack of them. Versailles wasn't unique in its problem of courtiers relieving themselves in hallways. Other palaces had the same issues. Sanitation was primitive everywhere. Even when toilets existed, they weren't connected to proper sewage systems. Waste often just collected in pits or was tossed into the nearest moat, which meant that Europe's most glittering courts were also some of its smelliest. The association of royalty with perfume wasn't just about luxury, it was survival. Without constant dousing in rosewater, no one could stand the stench. What's fascinating is how long this lasted. Even as the Enlightenment brought new ideas about science and medicine, hygiene lagged behind. It wasn't really until the 19th century, with the rise of germ theory and the installation of modern plumbing, that daily bathing became a norm. Which means that for centuries, the people running Europe, the kings, queens, emperors, and tsars, were quite literally some of the dirtiest people around dot. So what do we do with this information? Well, it gives us a more human view of history. We like to imagine kings and queens as majestic, untouchable figures. But in reality, they had bad breath, body odor, and questionable bathroom habits. They were just as human as anyone else, sometimes more so. Their bodies were frail, their medicine ineffective, their palaces smelly. And yet they built images of grandeur so powerful that we still look back and see only gold, lace, and majesty. Louis XIV may be the poster child for royal filth, but he was hardly alone. His world was one where filth and glory coexisted, where perfume masked reality, and where a king could avoid bathing for decades while convincing everyone he was the very image of divine power. And maybe that's the most interesting part, not the filth itself, but the illusion. The Sun King didn't smell good, but he made people believe he shone dot. So, as we drift to the very end of this very long, Very sleepy journey, remember that history isn't clean. It's messy, smelly, and sometimes downright disgusting. Behind every polished portrait is a person who sweated, a palace that stank, and a dynasty that probably could have used a bar of soap. The Sun King may have set, but his shadow, perfumed and pungent, still lingers in the way we think about power, image, and yes, hygiene. And with that thought, I'll leave you to sleep. May your dreams be golden like Versailles, but a little fresher smelling. We've wandered through Versailles in all its glittering filth. We've watched Louis XIV avoid baths, endure surgeries, and stage manage his bowels as though they were matters of state. We've traced the stink from his chambers to his heirs, and from France across Europe. But before we tuck ourselves in and let this story fade away, it's worth asking one final question. Why do we care so much about this? Why are we still talking about the Sun King's questionable hygiene 3 centuries later? Part of the answer is simple. It's funny. There's something irresistible about the contrast between the image of absolute majesty and the reality of chamber pots in the hallway. It's the same reason people love hearing about celebrities with weird habits today. The bigger the star, the stranger the quirk seems. Louis XIV was the ultimate celebrity of his age, the absolute monarch, the divine Sun King, and finding out that he smelled like a damp linen closet is just deliciously ironic, but there's more to it than humor. These details bring history down to earth. When we talk about Louis XIV's wars or treaties, it all feels distant, abstract. But when we talk about his toothless grin or his fistula surgery, suddenly he feels human. He suffered. He aged. He smelled. And in that, we recognize something of ourselves. Maybe not the fistula part, hopefully, but certainly the vulnerability. History becomes less about marble statues and more about living, breathing, sweating people. There's also the fact that filth is memorable. You probably won't recall the exact terms of the Treaty of Nijmegen, but you'll remember that courtiers relieved themselves in Versailles stairwells. Our brains latch onto the gross, the bizarre, the shocking. Teachers know this, throw one disgusting detail into a lecture, and students will carry it with them forever. The stink sticks quite literally dot, and then there's the cultural fascination with decay. Every society has its golden ages, but we're often more intrigued by their cracks. Ancient Rome built aqueducts, but we love to dwell on the vomitoriums in excess. Medieval castles look romantic, but we giggle about chamber pots dumped from the windows. Versailles dazzled, but we whisper about the smell. It's the shadow side of grandeur that makes it feel real. Louis XIV's hygiene also fits into a bigger story about power. Because hygiene, or the lack of it, wasn't just personal, it was political. To bathe or not to bathe wasn't just a quirky choice. It was a worldview. Louis embodied the idea that image mattered more than substance. He didn't need to be clean. He needed to look radiant. He didn't need fresh breath. He needed a towering wig and a gilded hall of mirrors. Power is, at its core, about performance. And filth, hidden under perfume and lace, was just part of the stagecraft. It also reminds us that progress isn't neat. We like to think history moves forward in a straight line, dirty past, clean present. But the truth is more complicated. Romans 2,000 years ago had better plumbing than Louis XIV. Medieval bathhouses were popular, long before the Sun King decided water was dangerous. Hygiene advanced, retreated, and advanced again, which means that our modern sense of cleanliness isn't inevitable. It's fragile, cultural, and constantly shifting. Someday, people might look back at us and laugh at our hand sanitizer obsessions, just as we laugh at Louis' enemas. And maybe that's why these stories help us sleep. Because they take the mighty down a peg. They remind us that no one, not even the Sun King, is untouchable. He had all the power in the world, yet he couldn't stop his teeth from rotting or his palace from stinking. His reign glittered, but his body fell apart like anyone else's. There's comfort in that. A strange, smelly comfort. So, as we wrap up this long, slow drift through Versailles, let's hold on to that thought. History isn't just about kings and battles. It's about smells, sores, superstitions, and strange little habits. It's about the messy, unglamorous details that never make it into official portraits, but which tell us more about the past than any crown jewel ever could. Louis XIV will always be remembered as the sun, king, but in our quiet corner tonight, he's also the king who never bathed. And honestly, that might be the truer legacy. So close your eyes now. Picture the chandeliers flickering out one by one. Picture the perfumes fading into the night. Picture the empty halls of Versailles, finally quiet, finally still. The king is gone, the stink has lifted, and all that remains is the story. And if that story helps you drift into sleep, then Louis XIV has given you one last gift. Not sunlight, not glory, just a strangely comforting reminder that even kings were human and sometimes very, very smelly. Good night. By now, we've gotten very cozy with Louis XIV and his perfume-drenched filth. But the Sun King was far from alone. If he were alive today, he could have started a whole club for rulers with questionable hygiene. And honestly, the membership list would have stretched across half of Europe. Because if we peek into other palaces around the same time, we find plenty of monarchs who weren't exactly poster children for cleanliness. Let's start in Spain. The Spanish Habsburgs were famous for their, shall we say, unfortunate genetics. Centuries of inbreeding produced kings who were not only fragile, but often, frankly, a little grotesque. Take Charles II of Spain, nicknamed El Hechizado, the Bewitched. He reigned from 1665 to 1700, right in Louis XIV's time. Poor Charles had such a deformed jaw that he could barely chew food. He drooled constantly, spoke with difficulty, and was plagued by endless illnesses. Hygiene was the least of his problems, but it didn't help that Spanish court culture was every bit as unwashed as Versailles. His body was fragile, his breath unpleasant, and his palace filled with priests muttering prayers instead of doctors washing their hands. Spoiler, the prayers didn't work. Charles died childless, and his death triggered the War of Spanish Succession, one of Louis XIV's big headaches. Now, let's drift north to England. Henry VIII gets most of the attention when we talk about gross monarchs, but his daughter, Elizabeth I, had her quirks too. She supposedly bathed once a month, which in her time was practically obsessive cleanliness. But her teeth, ruined by a sweet tooth for candied treats, turned black in her later years. Courtiers, eager to flatter her, actually filed their own teeth down and stained them so they would match hers. Imagine a whole court full of people smiling with rotting, darkened teeth, pretending it was fashion. Perfume could cover the body odors, but nothing quite masks the scent of infected gums. And then there's Russia. The Russian court had its own eccentricities. Tsar Peter the Great, who reigned from 1682 to 1725, actually was a fan of bathing, but in a terrifying, chaotic way. He loved dragging his nobles into freezing rivers or steam baths, more as punishment than hygiene. He also had a habit of performing amateur surgeries on his courtiers pulling teeth, lancing boils, whatever struck him as fun after a night of drinking. Imagine being summoned by your Tsar, only to have him decide your molar looked loose. Dentistry by drunken monarch. Sleep well with that image. Meanwhile, in Austria, the Habsburg court wasn't much cleaner than their Spanish cousins. The Empress Maria Theresa, ruling in the 18th century, insisted on enormous powdered wigs and layers of gowns that made bathing almost impossible. She was said to dislike strong perfumes, but that didn't mean people actually smelled good around her. It just meant they smelled natural, very natural. Palaces in Vienna, like Versailles, often doubled as giant indoor bathrooms for courtiers unwilling to hike to the nearest privy, and we can't forget about Louis XIV's neighbors, the Italians. Italian courts had their own quirks. Renaissance Italy had once been fond of public baths, but by the 17th century, those had fallen out of fashion. Nobles preferred scented gloves and scented hair pomades. Gloves soaked in perfume became so popular that people wore them constantly, even while eating. Which, if you think about it, means they were smearing perfume oils all over their food as well. Garlic pasta with a hint of civet cat truly royal dining. It wasn't just Europe, of course. Around the world, rulers had their own approaches to cleanliness. The Ottoman sultans, for example, had access to some of the most luxurious baths ever built, Turkish hammams that were architectural wonders. But even they sometimes preferred layers of musk and rose oil over an actual soak. Smelling good mattered more than being clean, which was, after all, the role of the era. What ties all these rulers together is that they lived in worlds where the performance of power outweighed any concern for sanitation. Kings and queens didn't need to bathe. They needed to look dazzling, to smell expensive, to embody authority. If the courtiers fainted from the smell, well, that was their problem. And here's where we circle back to Louis XIV. His Versailles wasn't uniquely filthy. It was just the most famous example of a universal royal truth. Palaces were glamorous on the outside, grimy on the inside. Monarchs were dressed in silks, but sweating underneath. Their teeth gleamed in portraits, but not in reality. Their perfumed gloves hit unwashed hands. And history, bless it, remembers the glitter while conveniently forgetting the stink, until now, of course, when we drag it all back out for bedtime stories. So maybe Louis XIV's club of unhygienic monarchs should have an honorary motto. Something like, perfume before soap, always. Or maybe just, if it smells bad enough, make it fashion. They certainly lived by it. And on that note, let's slowly close the doors on this bonus gallery of royal grime. From Spain to Russia, from England to Austria, the story is the same. Power doesn't need a bath. It just needs an audience willing to pretend, which is, I suppose, as good a place as any to drift into sleep. Surrounded by monarchs and lace, wigs, and very questionable smells. Sweet dreams.